What was truly believed about Kaiser's supposedly impossible ships by FDR is explored. A deeper understanding of the perspectives and strategic considerations of the era will be gained by viewers. The Pacific wind carried the scent of salt and steel across the docks of Richmond, California. It was 1942, and America's war machine was roaring awake. Amid the thundering clang of hammers and the blinding sparks of welding torches, a revolution in shipbuilding was quietly unfolding, one that would defy every known law of industrial production. And at the center of it stood a man the Navy never trusted, a man the experts called a dreamer, even a fool, Henry J. Kaiser. Yet behind the curtain of optimism and propaganda posters, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt watched with both admiration and suspicion. He admired Kaiser's impossible drive, his unbreakable will to get things done. But FDR also wondered, was this maverick industrialist the savior America needed, or a dangerous gambler building ships too fast for their own good? The story of FDR and Kaiser isn't just about ships. It's about the collision between government caution and private ambition, between vision and skepticism, between a president who demanded miracles and a man audacious enough to promise them. The United States had entered World War II just months before, shaken by the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Pacific Fleet lay crippled and the Atlantic convoys bled men and material under relentless U-boat attacks. Every ton of steel, every gallon of fuel, every bolt of rivets suddenly meant survival. The United States needed ships hundreds, then thousands, to feed a war spread across two oceans. But traditional shipbuilding was too slow. The great yards on the East Coast were bound by bureaucracy, unions, and outdated methods that took nearly a year to build a single freighter. The math didn't work. If America couldn't outbuild the destruction it would lose. Then came Henry Kaiser. He wasn't a shipbuilder, he was a contractor known for highways, dams, and concrete. He had helped construct the Hoover Dam and the Grand Coulee, feats of modern engineering that reshaped the West. But ships, he had never built one in his life. To the Navy's old guard, that was reason enough to dismiss him. To Kaiser, it was reason to try. When Kaiser proposed building cargo ships faster and cheaper than anyone else, naval officials laughed. They called his ideas reckless, his plans impossible, the kind of thing only a showman or a fool would suggest. But FDR wasn't so sure. He had a soft spot for visionaries, for those who bent reality to necessity. Still, he knew the stakes. If Kaiser fails, one aide warned, the whole industrial promise of the war effort could unravel. FDR leaned back in his wheelchair, cigarette holder dangling at a sharp angle, eyes half hidden behind steel-rimmed glasses. "Let him try," he said quietly. "If he's wrong, we'll know soon enough, but if he's right, he might just win us this war." And so, in early 1941, before the bombs of Pearl Harbor even fell, Kaiser broke ground on his first shipyard. He called it Richmond Shipyard No. 1. From the start, Kaiser did everything differently. Where old yards built ships on one slip at a time, Kaiser multiplied the process, turning shipbuilding into an assembly line. He hired workers no one else would take, women, immigrants, black laborers from the South, and trained them from scratch. He divided construction into modular sections, prefabricated hulls, pre-assembled decks, pre-wired engines that could be built simultaneously and fused together like the pieces of a puzzle. What once took 350 days, he cut down to 60, then 40. Then 20. Reporters began calling them Kaiser's miracles. Others weren't so kind. They called his ships Kaiser coffins, cheap vessels that would fall apart under the weight of war. Even within Roosevelt's own administration, doubts festered. Behind closed doors, FDR's aides debated the gamble. Could Kaiser's breakneck methods produce reliable vessels, or were they mass-producing disasters? Roosevelt listened, rarely interrupting. His mind worked like a chess player's, always 2 moves ahead, weighing risk against reward. At last he said, "Gentlemen, war does not reward the careful, it rewards the bold." By late 1942, Kaiser's shipyards were running around the clock, 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week. The night sky above San Francisco Bay glowed orange from molten steel. In the cafeteria, welders dozed beside their lunches. Posters shouted, "Speed the ship for victory," and "Every day counts." It was an industrial miracle, but one fueled by exhaustion and urgency. And FDR watched closely. In one of his letters to Harry Hopkins, his most trusted advisor, he wrote, "Kaiser's output defies logic, the figures must be verified, but if true, this man is doing the impossible, perhaps that's what we need. When the first Liberty ships rolled out sturdy, square, and slow, they weren't elegant. They were ugly, boxy, crude. The press called them ugly ducklings. But Roosevelt didn't care about beauty. He cared about tonnage, cargo, and speed of production. He once quipped to an aide, "They may be ugly, but they'll deliver democracy to every corner of the globe." And they did. The first Liberty ship, the SS Patrick Henry, launched amid cheers and confetti. Kaiser's men watched proudly as the president's message was read aloud. "She will carry the goods against the Axis powers. She will carry freedom to the world." But behind that triumph, cracks began to show, literally. Some Liberty ships began developing brittle fractures in cold water. A few even split in half without warning. Roosevelt's advisors pounced. "I told you," one Navy man barked, "they're built too fast, they're cheap junk held together by luck." But FDR remained calm. "And yet," he said, "they float, they deliver, and the men inside them are alive to fight another day." In his mind, Kaiser's ships represented the heart of America's war spirit, not perfection but relentless innovation. By 1943, Kaiser's shipyards were producing one ship every 3.5 days. One record-breaking vessel, the SS Robert E. Peary, was built in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. The press swarmed the launch, flashbulbs exploded, workers stood shoulder to shoulder as the champagne bottle shattered on the bow. It wasn't just a launch, it was a statement. And somewhere in the White House, Franklin Roosevelt received the report, grinning at the headline. "Impossible ship built in 4 days." He turned to his aides and said, "Gentlemen, never tell me something can't be done." But privately, he added in a memo, "Kaiser's speed must not come at the cost of safety. We are winning the race, but I would not have our victory rest on a foundation of brittle steel." Roosevelt respected Kaiser deeply but never fully trusted him. Kaiser's methods were wild, his temper fiery. His ambition unchecked. To FDR, he was both the best and worst of American industry, the genius of progress wrapped in the chaos of profit. Still, he knew one thing: without Kaiser, the seas might have belonged to Hitler. The Liberty ships changed everything. They brought tanks to Africa, food to Britain, and soldiers to every front line. They were the lifeline of the Allies. Even Winston Churchill, skeptical at first, admitted, "The extraordinary output of American shipyards has turned the tide of the war." And Henry Kaiser, he became a legend, a symbol of what America could achieve when fear was replaced with urgency. Yet Roosevelt's inner circle kept asking the same question: how long could this pace last before it broke the system or the man himself? Kaiser didn't care. He was already dreaming of bigger things: hospitals, housing, even post-war prosperity. "If we can build ships like this," he said, "why not rebuild America?" And in the Oval Office, FDR listened to those words with quiet intrigue. Because in Kaiser's vision he saw a reflection of his own. Two men, separated by background but bound by belief that America's greatness was built not in comfort but in challenge. But the story of FDR's real thoughts about Kaiser didn't end with admiration. There was conflict brewing, political, personal, and industrial. Roosevelt's support for Kaiser would soon be tested by scandal, by jealousy, and by the brutal realities of war production. And behind the glow of the shipyards, a darker truth was emerging. The very speed that made Kaiser famous might soon threaten the safety of thousands at sea. The first signs of trouble came not from the Navy's inspectors but from the sea itself. In the bitter Atlantic winter of 1943, ships began to vanish. Reports trickled in, one Liberty ship after another, lost not to torpedoes but to mysterious structural failures. Some crews survived long enough to radio distress calls, others simply disappeared into the gray waves. When the SS John P. Gaines broke in off the Aleutian coast, it stunned Washington. Investigators sent photographs to the White House, images of a Liberty ship's bow floating lifelessly, the stern gone beneath the surf. To many, it was proof that Kaiser's miracle had limits. At the Navy Department, officials seized the moment. "We warned you, Mr. President," they said, "you can't mass-produce ships like automobiles." Roosevelt listened, his face unreadable. Then he asked, "How many ships have we lost?" 17 to structural failure, perhaps more we haven't confirmed. "And how many have we launched?" "Over 2,000, sir." The president took a slow drag on his cigarette, the tip glowing like an ember in the dim light. Then, I'd say Mr. Kaiser has earned a margin of error. Still, Roosevelt ordered a quiet investigation. The press never learned the full details, but metallurgists soon discovered the problem: poor welding techniques and a new type of steel that turned brittle in freezing temperatures. The failures weren't the fault of speed alone, but of inexperience. Thousands of welders were learning on the job, many of them women who had never set foot in a factory before the war. Roosevelt didn't punish Kaiser. Instead, he pushed for better training programs and stricter oversight. "We are not perfect," he wrote to the War Production Board, "but perfection can wait until victory." Meanwhile, Kaiser pressed forward. He didn't slow down, he built faster. He opened new yards at Vancouver and Portland, creating a workforce that would swell past 200,000 men and women. He provided childcare centers, medical clinics, and housing, revolutionary concepts at the time. Kaiser's philosophy was simple: treat workers like family and they'll work like warriors. FDR watched these developments with fascination. He saw in Kaiser a kind of industrial social experiment, a blend of capitalism and compassion that mirrored his own New Deal ideals. When advisors mocked Kaiser's worker welfare programs as soft, Roosevelt replied, "He's not soft, he's smart. A happy worker builds a faster ship." The two men shared letters, occasional visits, and a cautious mutual respect. Yet FDR never invited Kaiser into his inner political circle. He admired him but kept him at arm's length, a powerful ally who was never quite a friend. Because deep down, Roosevelt knew that Kaiser's loyalty was to results, not to politics. And in wartime Washington, that made him unpredictable. By mid-1943, Kaiser's shipyards were outproducing entire nations. Britain's docks couldn't keep up, Japan's were under siege, and even Germany's vaunted shipyards were being pounded into dust. At a press briefing, a journalist asked Roosevelt, "Mr. President, is it true that Henry Kaiser has become your most valuable shipbuilder?" Roosevelt smiled faintly. "Mr. Kaiser," he said, "is a man who believes the impossible simply takes a little longer, and I find that sort of optimism rather useful these days." Privately, however, FDR's trust was being tested again. The Army's Contracts Division began raising red flags about Kaiser's costs. His operations were enormous, billions in government money flowing through his hands. Rumors swirled of mismanagement, favoritism, even profiteering. None of it proven, but enough to make the White House uneasy. Harry Hopkins defended him fiercely. "The man's building ships faster than anyone alive," he told Roosevelt. "If there's waste, it's the price of winning the war." Roosevelt nodded. "Perhaps, but I don't want another teapot dome on my hands. Keep him watched, but keep him building." In the shipyards, Kaiser's world was chaos and order in equal measure. Sparks showered the docks like golden rain, workers sang over the roar of engines. The night shift blurred into dawn. One welder later recalled, "We weren't just building ships, we were building hope. Every rivet, every seam was a bullet against Hitler." And for a time, that's exactly how Roosevelt saw it. He had always believed that wars were won not just on battlefields but in factories, farms, and foundries. Kaiser embodied that belief, turning civilian energy into military strength. When Kaiser proposed constructing massive floating dry docks to repair warships at sea, the Navy scoffed again. "Impossible," they said. Roosevelt didn't hesitate. "Then it's right up his alley," he replied. Within months, the dry docks were operational, huge steel platforms capable of lifting damaged cruisers and carriers from the water. They kept the Pacific Fleet fighting. They kept Roosevelt's promise that America would never retreat for lack of ships. But behind the triumphs there was exhaustion. Workers fainted from 12-hour shifts. The constant pressure to beat yesterday's record led to burnout, injuries, even strikes. Kaiser tried to fix what he could: more rest breaks, more clinics, better rations, but even he couldn't escape the crushing momentum of wartime demand. The machine he had built was consuming itself. By 1944, the end of the war was in sight. Allied armies stormed Normandy. American bombers burned German cities by night. Across the Pacific, the tide had turned. Kaiser had done what he promised. He had made the impossible possible. His Liberty ships, thousands strong, now filled harbors from London to Manila. And yet, as victory drew near, Roosevelt's tone began to shift. He still praised Kaiser publicly, but in private he began to wonder what would happen when the war was over. Would Kaiser fade quietly into history, or would he become too powerful to ignore? Because even as the guns of war thundered abroad, Kaiser's ambitions were shifting. He wasn't content with ships anymore. He wanted to reshape America itself, to build homes, hospitals, even a new kind of healthcare for the working class. And for the first time, Roosevelt felt a flicker of unease. This wasn't just about shipbuilding anymore. It was about what kind of America would emerge after the war and who would lead it. FDR had trusted Kaiser with steel and ships, but could he trust him with the soul of the nation? When Roosevelt first heard of Kaiser's post-war ambitions, it came not through official channels but through whispers in Washington's corridors. Senators spoke of a plan to convert shipyards into peacetime factories, to turn the same relentless production that had fueled the war into the engine of a new American dream. But what truly caught Roosevelt's attention was Kaiser's new obsession: healthcare. While America's industries were still roaring for war, Kaiser had begun quietly building hospitals for his shipyard workers, clinics with modern equipment, salaried doctors, and no billing at the bedside. It was unlike anything the nation had seen, a system built not for profit but for prevention. Kaiser called it industrial medicine. To the men and women of Richmond, it was a miracle. To FDR, it was something more. It was the seed of an idea he had long dreamed of: universal health security for all Americans. Yet he knew how fiercely the insurance companies and medical lobbies would resist. When Roosevelt read Kaiser's internal memo outlining a plan for nationwide health coverage after the war, he tapped the page thoughtfully and murmured, "So, the man of ships now turns to souls." Harry Hopkins, seated beside him, chuckled, "If he builds hospitals the way he builds ships, we'll have one on every street corner." Roosevelt smiled faintly but said nothing. The thought lingered. In Henry Kaiser, he saw not just an industrialist but a visionary, one whose ambitions might soon rival his own. Meanwhile, Kaiser's fame had reached mythic levels. Time magazine hailed him as the miracle builder. Photographs of him standing before Liberty ships, hard hat glinting under floodlights, appeared in newspapers across the country. To the public, he was the embodiment of America's can-do spirit. But not everyone celebrated. Business rivals muttered that Kaiser's empire was built on government money and political favoritism. Politicians whispered that his influence was growing too fast, his ambitions too wide. Some even began to call him the second Roosevelt. And that comparison did not go unnoticed inside the White House. FDR, ever the strategist, admired Kaiser's energy but feared his independence. Unlike other industrial titans, Kaiser didn't play by Washington's rules. He didn't lobby quietly or wait for approval, he simply acted, confident that results would silence his critics. In private, Roosevelt once remarked, "Kaiser builds as if democracy were a race against time." Perhaps he's right, but even a race must have rules. Yet Roosevelt couldn't afford to restrain him. The war still raged, the Pacific still burned, and America still needed ships. By late 1944, Kaiser's yards had produced over 5,000 vessels: Liberty ships, tankers, troop transports, landing craft, and repair docks. Each one bore the imprint of his unorthodox methods. Reporters touring Richmond described a scene of controlled chaos: hundreds of cranes swinging in rhythm, trains shuttling steel plates like clockwork, sparks dancing in the dark like stars. "It looks less like a shipyard," one correspondent wrote, "and more like the beating heart of a nation." Roosevelt received those reports with pride. "This," he said to Hopkins, "is what we meant when we said the arsenal of democracy." But even as he spoke, his health was failing. The strain of war, the endless pressures of leadership, and years of illness were taking their toll. The vibrant voice that had guided America through depression and war now came slower, softer, edged with fatigue. And yet, in his final months, Roosevelt's mind never stopped turning toward the future. He began drafting his vision for a post-war America, an economic bill of rights that would guarantee every citizen housing, education, and health care. It was a vision that echoed, almost word for word, Henry Kaiser's own post-war plans. When Roosevelt's advisors informed Kaiser that the president wished to discuss industrial conversion and health policy, Kaiser was elated. He prepared charts, blueprints, even drafted proposals for what he called the Great Construction of Peace. But the meeting never happened. In April 1945, Franklin Delano Roosevelt died in Warm Springs, Georgia. The nation mourned, stunned by the sudden loss of the man who had led them through their darkest years. When the news reached Richmond, work stopped. For the first time in years, the shipyard fell silent. Welders laid down their torches, men wept openly, women stood in silence beside the hulls they had built. Henry Kaiser gathered his supervisors and addressed them from a small wooden platform overlooking the docks. "The president believed in us when others did not," he said quietly. "He gave us the chance to prove that America could outbuild fear. We will not stop now." And they didn't. Even as the war drew to its final days, Kaiser's men worked on, finishing ships that would never see combat but would soon carry soldiers home. In Washington, as the new administration under Harry Truman took shape, Kaiser's role began to fade from the spotlight. The war was ending, contracts were being canceled, and peacetime politics were returning with their old habits of caution and compromise. Yet the legacy Kaiser had forged was impossible to erase. He had built ships faster than any man in history. He had proven that innovation, inclusivity, and speed could coexist, and he had forced even the most traditional corners of government to rethink what was possible. Still, inside the Oval Office, the question Roosevelt had once pondered remained unanswered. What did FDR truly think of Henry Kaiser? Publicly, he praised him as a patriot. Privately, his letters reveal a more complex view, a mixture of admiration, envy, and quiet concern. In one note to Hopkins, written in early 1945, Roosevelt described Kaiser as a man born out of time, too bold for the bureaucrats, too restless for the system, and too necessary to ignore. Perhaps that was the closest FDR ever came to confession. After the war, Kaiser moved swiftly. He turned his wartime clinics into what would become Kaiser Permanente, America's first large-scale prepaid healthcare system. He launched ventures in aluminum, steel, housing, and automobiles. He dreamed of a new industrial America where prosperity was shared by all. But the Washington establishment had changed. Without Roosevelt, there was no one left who understood him, no leader willing to gamble on his grand experiments. And yet, in every post-war highway, every suburban home, every hospital bearing his name, Henry Kaiser carried a piece of that Roosevelt vision, a belief that America's strength was not just its weapons, but its will to build. Because for Roosevelt, even from beyond the grave, the legacy of Henry Kaiser remained the living proof of his own greatest lesson, that leadership meant daring others to do what the world called impossible. And for Kaiser, Roosevelt would always be the one man who, when others laughed, had simply said, "Let him try." In the years that followed the war, America entered a strange twilight between triumph and uncertainty. Cities buzzed with returning soldiers, factories shifted from tanks to toasters, and the world that had once lived by the sound of air raid sirens now pulsed with the hum of peacetime industry. Henry Kaiser stood at the edge of this transformation, restless as ever. The shipyards that had once thundered night and day were falling quiet, their cranes rusting, their slipways empty. The war contracts were over. The crowds were gone, but Kaiser could not stand still. He saw opportunity where others saw endings. "America," he told his son Edgar one evening, gazing out over the now silent Richmond yard, "has learned how to build the impossible. Now it's time to live the impossible." And with that, he set his sights beyond the ocean. Kaiser turned his war-built empire toward peace. He began constructing entire neighborhoods, modern homes for working families, affordable and efficient, designed with the same assembly line logic that had birthed the Liberty ships. He called it Kaiser Community Housing, and in his mind it was the next great revolution. But he wasn't done. He saw the growing automobile market and decided to compete with the giants of Detroit. In 1945, he founded Kaiser Motors, promising cars built for the people by the man who built their ships. Reporters were skeptical. General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, they had decades of experience, massive plants, and armies of engineers. Kaiser had vision and nerve. It wasn't enough to win a market, they said, but Kaiser didn't care. He had been told before that he couldn't build ships either. In quiet moments, he often thought of Roosevelt. The president's words still echoed in his mind. If he's wrong, we'll know soon enough, but if he's right. Kaiser had always felt that FDR understood him in a way few others did. They were both men who thrived on movement, on action before permission, on faith in human effort. After Roosevelt's death, Kaiser often spoke of him as though he were still alive. He believed in the builders, Kaiser told a journalist. He believed that no problem was too big for people who refused to wait for someone else to fix it. Privately, though, Kaiser sometimes admitted he missed Roosevelt's balancing influence. Truman's administration was colder, more cautious. Bureaucrats who once bent the rules for speed now demanded endless forms and reports. The wartime urgency was gone, replaced by post-war politics and suspicion. To men like Kaiser, that was death by paper. His healthcare idea, the one that had so intrigued Roosevelt, faced fierce opposition. The American Medical Association branded it socialized medicine. Insurance companies lobbied Congress to curb it. Doctors refused to participate, calling Kaiser's system an insult to the profession. But Kaiser pressed on. He opened his first post-war medical centers in California and Oregon, transforming his wartime clinics into a revolutionary network of affordable care. The concept was simple but radical: doctors on salary, patients on prepaid plans, and treatment focused on prevention instead of profit. It was, in many ways, Roosevelt's dream reborn in private hands. And though the government offered no help, Kaiser's system grew quietly, stubbornly, until it began to attract attention again. Reporters noted that thousands of workers now had access to medical care for the first time in their lives. If Roosevelt had lived, Kaiser said softly during one interview, he would have understood. He would have built this into the nation itself. There was truth in that. Roosevelt had planned to introduce a national healthcare bill in his fifth term. After his death, the plan died with him. Kaiser's vision filled the void, one hospital at a time. But not all of Kaiser's ventures flourished. His car company struggled. His aluminum and steel plants faced fierce competition. The great shipyards, once symbols of American might, now lay half-abandoned, ghosts of a miracle the nation no longer needed. The same speed that had made him a wartime hero now made him seem reckless in peacetime. Investors called him overambitious. Politicians dismissed him as a relic of emergency times. Yet for every setback, Kaiser built something new: housing, healthcare, schools, industries. He moved faster than the system could adapt. And in doing so, he created a pattern that mirrored the restless energy of Roosevelt's own life: always building, always pushing, never satisfied. He once told an old friend from the Richmond Yard, "The war ended, but the battle never did. It just changed shape." Meanwhile, historians began to reassess his wartime legacy. They pored over Roosevelt's archives, reading memos, letters, and notes between the president and his cabinet. In those faded pages, they found the truth of what FDR had really thought. He had admired Kaiser's audacity but worried about his reach. He had praised his speed but feared his recklessness. In one private note, Roosevelt wrote, "Kaiser's mind runs faster than regulation can follow. He will either be the salvation of production or the ruin of it." And in another, perhaps his most telling line, Roosevelt confided to Hopkins, "If America ever forgets the value of a man like Kaiser, it will forget how it won this war." That sentence would never be published in his lifetime, but when it was discovered years later, it became the defining testament to their strange, powerful partnership. By the early 1950s, Kaiser was no longer the unstoppable builder of the war years. His hair had turned silver, his face weathered by years of stress and vision. But his eyes, those sharp, restless eyes, still burned with the same fire that had once turned barren docks into the beating heart of victory. He walked through his new hospital in Oakland one afternoon, watching nurses and patients move through bright corridors. Children laughed in the waiting rooms. Doctors worked without fear of unpaid bills or corporate quotas. "This," he whispered, "is what Roosevelt wanted. This is what we were fighting for." Outside, the world was changing again. The Cold War had begun. The United States, once united by necessity, was now divided by ideology. The factories of freedom had become engines of profit, the builders had become bureaucrats. And Henry Kaiser, forever the dreamer, forever the defier of limits, was still building, still believing that America could be something more than what it had settled for. The Cold War years brought a new kind of tension, one that no amount of steel or concrete could fix. The race for arms, the shadow of nuclear fear, and the tightening grip of corporate power began reshaping America into something unrecognizable to the generation that had fought to save it. Henry Kaiser, now older but still impossibly driven, felt that shift like a weight pressing on his chest. His vision of an industrious, compassionate America, an America that built not just machines but opportunity, was being replaced by something colder, more calculated. He had never been a man for politics, yet politics now shaped everything he touched. His health plans drew fire from conservative lawmakers who saw them as creeping socialism. His housing projects were choked by zoning boards and red tape, and his car company, which had dared to challenge Detroit, was bleeding money. But in the midst of frustration, Kaiser refused to yield. Progress, he told a group of young engineers one afternoon, isn't about comfort, it's about courage. FDR knew that. He made us believe that if we built something good, the world would rise to meet it. And even as he said it, he could almost hear Roosevelt's voice again, steady, warm, commanding, echoing across the years. Let him try. By 1953, Kaiser's ventures stretched across nearly every major industry in America. Aluminum, cement, steel, power, housing, healthcare, automobiles, his name had become a symbol for ambition itself. But the empire was fragile. Too many fronts, too many risks. One of his advisors warned him, "Henry, you can't build the whole world yourself." Kaiser smiled almost wistfully. "I built half the Pacific Fleet in less than 5 years," he said. "Don't tell me what I can't build." It was arrogance, perhaps, but also faith, the same faith Roosevelt had once shared. Both men had believed that America's destiny was not to preserve the past, but to construct the future piece by piece with their own hands. But times were changing. The war had created a unity that peace could not sustain. The urgency that once drove millions to weld and hammer for a common cause had faded into suburban comfort and consumer ease. Kaiser's America, the America of relentless builders, was slowly being replaced by an America of buyers. Still, he found small victories in unexpected places. The Kaiser Permanente Medical System continued to expand, quietly becoming one of the most successful health organizations in the country. It served tens of thousands of families who might otherwise have gone without care. The old shipbuilder would visit the hospitals sometimes, walking the halls unnoticed. He'd talk to patients, nurses, and young doctors who didn't even realize the gray-haired man beside them had once built the ships that won their freedom. In those quiet visits he seemed at peace. "I used to build ships to carry men to war," he once told a nurse. "Now I build hospitals to keep them home." It was, in its way, his final act of rebellion, turning the machinery of war into the machinery of life. And though Roosevelt was long gone, Kaiser often felt his spirit nearby, watching. The two men had shared something rare, a faith not in politics but in people. In the builders, the welders, the dreamers, the ones who looked at steel and saw possibility. In 1954, Kaiser traveled to Washington to attend a ceremony commemorating the 10th anniversary of D-Day. He stood among generals, admirals, and politicians, men who had once doubted him, men who now spoke of him as a legend. When it was his turn to speak, he looked out over the crowd, his voice steady but heavy with memory. "I remember a time," he began, "when this nation was told that something could not be done, that ships could not be built fast enough, that victory was too far, that hope was too late. But we built anyway, not because we were certain, but because we believed." He paused, letting the silence sink in. President Roosevelt believed in that kind of faith. He believed that America's greatest strength wasn't its power, it was its persistence. The applause was long and thunderous, but Kaiser barely seemed to hear it. For him, the speech wasn't about glory, it was about remembrance. That night, as he sat alone in his hotel room overlooking the Potomac, he opened an old file he had carried for years, a faded telegram from 1942 sent from the White House. The message was brief, typed in Roosevelt's unmistakable clipped style. Keep going, we will need every ship you can build, FDR. Kaiser read it again, slowly, tracing the edges of the worn paper with his fingers. Every ship you can build, he whispered, and we did, God help us, we did. Years passed, the world moved on. The Liberty ships, once the lifeline of freedom, began to rust away in distant harbors or were scrapped for parts. The shipyards of Richmond were quiet now, their hulking cranes standing like monuments to a forgotten race against time. Yet, the legacy of what had been done there lived on, in every container ship that crossed the Pacific, in every factory that ran on assembly line precision, in every new generation of builders who refused to accept limits. Roosevelt's belief and Kaiser's audacity had reshaped not just the war, but the very DNA of American industry. And even though history books often reduced Kaiser to a footnote beside giants of politics and war, those who knew his story understood the truth. He had built the very vessels on which victory sailed. In one of his last interviews, Kaiser reflected on those days. His voice was frail, but his conviction unbroken. They said it couldn't be done, he said softly, but Franklin said let him try, and that's all I ever needed. He looked out the window where the Pacific shimmered in the afternoon light. You know, he added with a faint smile, he never told me to stop trying. The years that followed saw the world transform in ways neither Roosevelt nor Kaiser could have fully imagined. The jet age roared into existence, highways carved through cities and plains, and the flicker of television replaced the fires of wartime industry as the nation's pulse. Yet beneath the modern veneer, the foundations they had poured of courage, unity, and daring innovation remained quietly alive. In the old shipyards of Richmond, a few of the workers who had once built Liberty ships returned in their twilight years. They brought their grandchildren, walking through the overgrown lots where ghosts of steel hulls seemed to hum in the wind. The children would ask, "Did you really make ships here?" And the old men would smile, their eyes bright with memory. "We didn't just make ships," one said, "we made history." For many of them, Henry Kaiser's name was still sacred. He had been more than a boss, he had been a visionary who saw potential where others saw impossibility. When other men spoke of limits, he saw challenges. When others saw shortages, he saw opportunities. To them, he embodied that rare breed of American spirit that Roosevelt had spoken of in his fireside talks, the belief that progress was not inherited, but earned through will and imagination. The post-war years, however, had not been kind to dreamers like Kaiser. The corporate landscape hardened, competition grew ruthless, and the spirit of experimentation gave way to caution. Still, his fingerprints remained everywhere, from the healthcare system that bore his name to the modern methods of mass production that shaped post-war prosperity. By the late 1950s, Kaiser had largely withdrawn from public life. His body was slowing, but his mind remained as restless as ever. Visitors recalled how he would sit for hours at his desk, surrounded by photographs, Roosevelt at the launch of a Liberty ship, workers in overalls and welding masks, the American flag draped across the prow of a new vessel. He would study them like a general reviewing his troops, as though searching for something unfinished. One evening, while speaking to a young reporter, he was asked if he missed the war years, the chaos, the urgency, the sense of purpose that had driven him. He smiled faintly. "You don't miss war," he said. "You miss what it made people capable of." He paused, looking out the window at the harbor lights. "You miss the feeling that we could do anything if we tried hard enough. That was Roosevelt's gift to us, he made us believe." The reporter asked him what he thought FDR would say if he could see America now. Kaiser chuckled softly. "He'd probably say we've gotten too comfortable. That we've forgotten what it means to be desperate for something better." Then his eyes hardened slightly as if remembering a challenge. "But I think he'd also say we're still capable of greatness, we just need to be told to try again." It was always about trying. That was the word that bound them, Roosevelt the dreamer, Kaiser the doer. One envisioned, the other executed. Together they proved that faith in effort could reshape the world. In 1957, Kaiser visited the remains of his old Richmond shipyard. The wind howled through empty frames where cranes once swung and sparks once flew. He stood silently for a long time, the Pacific breeze tugging at his coat. A small group of former foremen joined him, hats in hand. One of them whispered, "Hard to believe it's all gone." Kaiser shook his head slowly. "It's not gone," he said, "it's just sleeping." He ran his hand along a rusted beam, the metal flacking beneath his fingers. "Every piece of this place tells a story, and somewhere out there," he gestured toward the horizon, "those ships are still sailing." That night, as he rode back toward Oakland, he asked his driver to slow down when they crossed the bridge. The lights of the bay reflected off the water like molten steel, and for a moment he could almost see the silhouettes of Liberty ships gliding through the mist, their engines humming the old industrial song of war and hope. The memory was almost too vivid, men shouting, welders sparking, hulls ringing with the rhythm of a nation in motion. He leaned back in his seat, eyes closed, and murmured, "We were unstoppable once." A year later, Kaiser's health began to decline, but even in frailty his mind was alive with plans. Visitors were astonished to find him sketching designs for new hospitals, new dams, even new energy systems. One of his assistants joked, "Mr. Kaiser, you never quit, do you?" He smiled. "I told Franklin once that rest was for people without ideas." Then almost wistfully he added, "Maybe that's why he liked me." Every evening he'd sit by the window and listen to the radio. Sometimes it played music, sometimes news, but occasionally an old recording of Roosevelt's voice would fill the room, words from a fireside chat broadcast decades earlier. The tone, calm and resolute, carried through the air like a ghost returning home. "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," the voice would say. Kaiser would close his eyes and nod slowly. "You were right, Franklin," he'd whisper, "and you proved it every day." Outside, the world he helped build kept moving forward, faster, louder, more complex. But somewhere in that noise, the echo of a different time still lingered. The clang of steel, the hiss of steam, the hum of determination that once united an entire nation. And Henry Kaiser, builder of the impossible, still believed that one spark of faith in the right hands could awaken it again. The world rolled into the 1960s, a new generation rising under a sky filled with rockets instead of bombers. The old heroes of industry had faded from headlines, replaced by scientists, politicians, and television figures. Yet in small corners of the country, people still whispered about the man who had built a fleet faster than anyone thought possible, about Kaiser's miracle yards, and about how Roosevelt had believed in him when no one else would. Kaiser, now older and frailer, spent his days in Hawaii, the place that had once been a key destination for his wartime ships. His estate overlooked the ocean, the same Pacific that had carried his dreams and thousands of American soldiers to the other side of the world. Every morning he would walk the beach slowly, cane in hand, watching the waves curl and collapse against the sand. The sea had a rhythm he never grew tired of. To him, it was the same rhythm that once pulsed through his shipyards, constant, powerful, relentless. He often entertained visitors, businessmen, politicians, young engineers who came seeking advice from the old legend. Some came out of respect, others out of curiosity. They would sit with him in the garden while he sipped coffee and listened more than he spoke. One of them, a young industrial designer from California, once asked, "Mr. Kaiser, how did you know you could do it? How did you know those ships could be built that fast?" Kaiser smiled faintly. "I didn't know," he said. "I just refused to believe it couldn't be done." He set his cup down carefully, eyes fixed on the horizon. "When Roosevelt said, 'Let him try,' he didn't just give me permission, he gave me responsibility. Every man who believed in that idea carried a piece of it with him. That's how we built those ships, through belief multiplied by millions." The young man nodded slowly. "Do you think we've lost that belief?" Kaiser didn't answer right away. He looked at the surf breaking against the rocks. "Not lost," he said finally, "just misplaced. It's waiting for someone to pick it up again." Occasionally, old film reels would be sent to him, documentaries showing grainy footage of the Liberty ships being launched one after another, sliding into the sea like steel leviathans. He'd watch them alone, sometimes smiling, sometimes wiping a quiet tear. The sound of the crowd cheering as each ship hit the water brought the memories rushing back. He could still see the welders in their masks, sparks flying like stars across the hull, the women in bandanas working the cranes, the engineers racing through blueprints with pencils tucked behind their ears. The smell of oil, steel, and salt in the air. It wasn't just industry, it was a symphony. To most of the world, they were just ships. To Kaiser, they were proof that the impossible could be built by human hands. One night, as a storm rolled in from the sea, he sat alone with a single lamp burning beside him, listening to the rain hammer against the windows. The sound reminded him of rivets striking metal. He thought about Roosevelt, how that single decision, that simple "let him try," had not only changed his life but had altered the course of the war. He remembered the moment they met, the president in his wheelchair, the firm handshake, the glint in his eye that told Kaiser he was being tested. Roosevelt had a gift for seeing beyond the obvious. He saw the potential in chaos, the opportunity hidden inside crisis. And Kaiser had matched that energy with something equally powerful: faith in motion. Together, they had proven that leadership and courage could forge miracles faster than fear could break them. Years later, in the quiet twilight of his life, Kaiser commissioned a small plaque for his study. It was simple, just a piece of brushed metal with 5 words engraved across it: "Let him try, FDR." Visitors would ask about it, expecting some grand story behind its placement, but Kaiser never explained. He would just run his fingers across the letters, smile softly, and say, "That's where it all began." His son Edgar Kaiser would later recall that the plaque seemed to represent something far greater than the man himself. "My father," Edgar said, "believed that trying was sacred. He thought the real sin wasn't failure, it was surrender." Even as his health weakened, Henry Kaiser remained restless. He sketched new ship designs, new housing projects, even plans for a trans-Pacific shipping route. His doctors begged him to slow down, but he'd just grin and say, "If I stop, the tide will catch me." In his final public address, delivered via radio in the early 1960s, he spoke to an audience of industrial workers and engineers. His voice was thin but unwavering. "Remember this," he said. "When they tell you something cannot be done, you're hearing the sound of fear. Don't listen to it. Listen instead to the sound of your own conviction. That's how we built a world once, and we can build it again." The broadcast was brief, but it struck a chord. Letters poured in from all over the country: former welders, engineers, and families who remembered the Liberty ships, who remembered what it felt like to believe in something bigger than themselves. And though Kaiser read them all, he never responded. He didn't have to. Their words were proof that what he'd built still mattered. At night, as he looked out over the Pacific, the reflection of the moon shimmering like liquid steel, he would think of those men and women, and of the man in the White House who had dared to trust him. He wondered if somewhere beyond the veil of time, Roosevelt could still see it all: the ships, the yards, the legacy that had outlived them both. And if he could, Kaiser liked to imagine the president smiling, that half-smile of his, cigarette holder tilted at an angle, saying in that familiar, confident voice, "Well, Henry, I told them to let you try." The days grew quieter, though the world around Henry Kaiser refused to slow down. The age of war had given birth to the age of expansion: space exploration, nuclear energy, new industries rising on the shoulders of old ones. But as the 1960s deepened, the heart of that ambition had begun to feel different. Where once there had been raw grit and unity, there was now bureaucracy, profit, and politics. Kaiser would sometimes read the newspapers and shake his head. Headlines about budget cuts, corporate mergers, political scandals, they felt so far removed from the sense of shared purpose that had once gripped the nation. "We've learned to calculate everything," he muttered one morning, "except courage." His housekeeper, who had worked with him for over a decade, found him one afternoon sitting by the radio, listening to a report about a new war in Southeast Asia. The same tone of worry filled the broadcast: new enemies, new battles, the same uncertainty. But what caught Kaiser's attention wasn't the war itself, it was the mention of shipbuilding. American yards, now automated and modern, were once again called upon to meet the nation's demand. He smiled faintly, his gaze distant. "They still remember," he said softly. "Even when they forget the names, they still remember how to build." The housekeeper didn't understand what he meant, but to Kaiser it was clear. The legacy of what he and Roosevelt had started wasn't in history books, it was in the hands that still welded steel, in the hearts that still believed in progress through effort. That night he couldn't sleep. He wandered through his study, the moonlight cutting across the rows of framed photos, black and white glimpses of ship launches, engineers, smiling factory workers, and the president himself. The room felt like a museum of triumphs and ghosts. He stopped before one photograph in particular: the first Liberty ship sliding into the water, thousands of men and women cheering along the dock. He remembered the sound of the sirens, the roar of the crowd, the blinding flash of cameras. That moment had felt like touching eternity. Impossible, they'd said, madness. And yet there it was, proof that the impossible had been done, not once but thousands of times over. As his strength waned, Kaiser began to dictate his memories into a recorder, hours of reflections, stories, and lessons. His voice trembled sometimes, but his words were sharp, alive with the energy of a man who had never stopped building. "I don't think Roosevelt ever saw ships the way most people did," he said in one recording. "He saw them as a metaphor for will, for faith, for unity. Every ship that left the yard carried not just soldiers but the belief that democracy could outbuild tyranny." He paused, breathing heavily before adding, "That's what made him remarkable. He didn't just lead a nation, he inspired it to move." Those recordings, later archived by his foundation, revealed something deeper than industry or engineering. They revealed a philosophy that creation was the truest act of defiance. For Kaiser, the greatest victory of all wasn't the war. It was proving that ordinary men and women could accomplish miracles when someone believed in them. Visitors continued to come, young entrepreneurs, historians, admirers of his work. They found him fragile but still fiery. He spoke of the future as if he were still standing in a shipyard surrounded by sparks. "You have to see past the rust," he'd tell them. "The world's full of old ideas dressed as new ones, but progress doesn't come from comfort, it comes from discomfort when people are told they can't and they decide to prove otherwise." He'd lean back, close his eyes, and smile faintly. That's what Roosevelt understood. That's why he changed history, not by commanding armies but by commanding belief. When one visitor asked him if he thought America would ever see another leader like FDR, Kaiser was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Not until we start listening to dreamers again, not until we stop asking, 'Can it be done?' and start saying, 'Let's try.'" The words hung in the air like a benediction. As the sun set one evening, he sat outside watching the ocean. The waves were golden under the fatting light. Each one rose and fell like the breath of something eternal. He thought of the men who never came back, of the ships that sank beneath these same waters, of the millions of souls who had believed enough to keep building. He whispered to no one in particular, "We were all trying to keep something alive. Maybe we still are." The horizon glowed crimson as the day faded into dusk. He closed his eyes and listened to the sound of the sea, steady, endless, unbroken. It was the same rhythm that had guided him his entire life. The next morning came with a light rain over the bay, soft and silver like the sky itself was remembering. Henry Kaiser sat by his window, watching droplets trail down the glass in delicate streams. The world outside blurred, waves, palm trees, clouds, all melting into one shimmering canvas of motion. For a moment he could almost see the hulls of his ship sliding again into the sea, the cheers rising over the storm, the flags snapping in the wind. He reached for his notebook, a small, leather-bound journal he had kept since the early 1940s. The pages were filled with sketches, calculations, and short notes to himself. But over the years they had also become a collection of reflections, each one written like a message to someone unseen. On the newest page, his handwriting was slower, the ink faint. He wrote, "Every time a nation forgets what it can build, it begins to lose what it stands for." He paused, looking at the words, then added beneath them, "Roosevelt never forgot, that's why we followed him." It was as if the pen itself carried the weight of memory. Each stroke felt like hammer and rivet, connecting past to present, building something invisible but real. Later that day, a historian from the mainland arrived, an earnest young man from a university who was preparing a book on wartime production. He had flown halfway across the Pacific just to interview Kaiser, knowing it might be the last chance anyone would have to hear him speak in person. They talked for hours in the garden, surrounded by the hum of cicadas and the distant murmur of surf. The historian's recorder clicked quietly as Kaiser's voice, cracked but commanding, filled the air. "Mr. Kaiser," the man asked, "do you think America could ever do what it did in 1942 again, build at that scale, that speed, with that unity?" Kaiser leaned back, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "We could," he said after a long silence. "But only if we remembered why we did it then. It wasn't just about winning a war, it was about proving who we were. People forget that." He turned toward the young man, his gaze sharp despite the years. "We didn't build ships because we had resources, we built them because we had purpose, and purpose, son, is rarer than steel." The historian nodded, struck by the gravity of his tone. Kaiser smiled faintly. "You write that down," he said softly. You tell them, don't let them think it was just factories and metal, it was spirit. That's what Roosevelt gave us, a reason to believe that building was a form of victory. As the day faded, the air filled with the scent of salt and rain. Kaiser's staff helped him back inside, but before they could close the door, he turned and looked out one last time toward the Pacific. A large cargo ship was passing on the distant horizon, its silhouette etched in twilight. For a long moment he said nothing, then, almost in a whisper, still moving. To anyone else it might have sounded like an idle comment, but to those who knew him it carried a deeper meaning. The ships he'd built were gone, but the idea, that relentless motion toward progress, had never stopped. That night, unable to sleep, he asked for the radio again. The voice of a news announcer crackled through the static, reading the headlines of a changing world: nuclear treaties, civil rights marches, new inventions. The world, it seemed, was still building, still reaching, still trying. He smiled to himself. That's all that matters, he murmured, as long as they're still trying. He leaned back in his chair, the ocean breeze drifting through the open window. Somewhere in the distance, the low hum of a ship's horn echoed across the bay. It was a familiar sound, low and resonant, carrying the same tone that had once filled the harbors of Richmond and Portland, an industrial lullaby. Kaiser closed his eyes and listened, his mind drifting back to those nights of ceaseless work when the whole coast thundered with creation. The sound faded slowly into silence, but he didn't open his eyes. He simply whispered, "We built a bridge of steel across the world and we never stopped." Outside, the Pacific rolled endlessly against the shore, each wave erasing and rewriting the same eternal story, the story of men who tried and of one leader who believed they could. The following week the weather shifted. The winds off the Pacific grew stronger, stirring the palms that framed Kaiser's home. The air smelled of salt and memory. Visitors came less frequently now, but those who did found him alert, even spirited. His voice carried the calm weight of a man who had made peace with time but refused to surrender his curiosity. Each morning he asked for the newspaper, not to read the front page but to study the back sections. The shipbuilding reports, industrial indexes, and new company announcements fascinated him still. He would trace the names of modern corporations with his finger, murmuring their production figures under his breath. "They're doing it differently," he'd say, "but they're still doing it. The rhythm changes, but the song doesn't." One afternoon, a journalist from Life magazine visited, hopping for a retrospective piece. She was young, full of enthusiasm, her notebook already open before she even sat down. "Mr. Kaiser," she said, "when you look back at everything, the dams, the ships, the hospitals, what are you most proud of?" He thought for a moment, then shook his head slowly. "Pride isn't quite the word," he said. "I'm grateful that I was alive in a time when men didn't wait for permission to begin. We didn't need guarantees, we had faith that if we started, others would follow." The journalist smiled. "That sounds like something President Roosevelt might have said." Kaiser's eyes lit up faintly. "He did," he replied, "not in those words but in that spirit. He didn't ask what was safe, he asked what was necessary. That's what made him dangerous in the best possible way." He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "You see, Franklin didn't just want ships or numbers, he wanted belief, and once people believe they can build the impossible, you can't stop them." The journalist was silent for a long time, the pen frozen above her page. There was something in his tone that felt like both a lesson and a warning. That evening after she left, Kaiser sat in his study with a cup of tea growing cold beside him. Outside, the surf was loud against the rocks, rolling in like thunder. He watched the moon rise slowly over the horizon and thought about how many nights he had seen that same moon reflected on the Pacific, during the war, during the ship launches, during his years of restless creation. In the reflection of the window, his own face looked faint, blurred by the light of the lamp. But behind that reflection he could almost see Roosevelt again, smiling, nodding, the cigarette holder tilted as if amused by something only he understood. Kaiser spoke softly to the reflection, his voice barely audible above the sea. "Franklin, I think you were right about people. They forget too fast, but they never lose the instinct to rise." He let out a breath, long and slow. "If only you could see what you started." A gust of wind rattled the window panes as if in response. Kaiser smiled faintly. "Maybe you do," he whispered. Weeks turned into months. Though his steps grew slower and his voice more fragile, his mind never stopped building. Visitors often found blueprints spread across his desk, new hospital wings, innovations for mass housing, even notes for an experimental energy project that used ocean currents. When asked why he kept designing things that might never be built, he answered simply, "Because somewhere someone will. Ideas don't die, they just wait for builders." Those who visited him often left changed not by his wealth or his achievements but by his quiet conviction. There was a gravity to him, a living echo of an era when people built with their hands and their hearts. One young naval architect, inspired by Kaiser's shipyard legacy, once told him, "Sir, your work made me believe that industry could have a soul." Kaiser smiled. "That's the point," he said. "Steel is lifeless until someone gives it purpose. Roosevelt taught me that. We weren't building machines, we were building lifelines." He paused, then added quietly, "And maybe we still are." That night, he walked onto his balcony overlooking the sea. The horizon stretched endlessly, the faint lights of distant ships blinking like stars across the dark water. He leaned on the railing, breathing in the salt air. It was there, in that stillness, that the past seemed closest, those long nights of engines roaring, welders shouting, the sound of the world being remade. In his mind, he could see the shipyards once more, the torches burning like constellations, the rhythmic clang of hammers, the silhouettes of workers illuminated against the glow of molten steel. It was all there, alive inside him as if time itself had never passed. And standing among those ghosts, he could almost hear Roosevelt's voice again, calm, certain, defiant. "The test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much, but whether we provide enough for those who have little." Kaiser closed his eyes and whispered, "We tried, Franklin, God knows we tried." The wind carried his words out over the ocean, dissolving them into the night. He stayed there a long time, the sea whispering below, the stars flickering above, until at last, the sound of a ship's distant horn rolled through the darkness, deep and solemn like an echo from another lifetime. He smiled, the world was still moving forward. In the months that followed, Henry Kaiser's days became a careful rhythm of reflection and observation. Though his body was fragile, his mind remained sharp, wandering through plans, ideas, and memories with the same restless energy that had once transformed empty docks into a fleet of Liberty ships. He no longer walked the shipyards, but he walked the corridors of thought, the blueprints of possibility stretching endlessly before him. One morning, a letter arrived from a former worker at the Richmond yard. It was simple yet profound. "Mr. Kaiser, I'm retired now, but I still tell my grandchildren how we built the impossible. I hope they remember what it meant to try." Kaiser read it slowly, his eyes misting. He set it aside and murmured to himself, "That's why we did it, that's the legacy Roosevelt entrusted to us." Later that day, he spoke to his assistant about expanding one of the Kaiser permanent hospitals into rural areas that had been neglected by medical systems. He sketched the idea roughly on a pad, circling locations, noting distances, imagining nurses and doctors moving through towns that had never known consistent care. "Even small towns," he said softly, "deserve to know someone believes in them. That's what we fought for in the yards, and we fight for it still." Outside, the world marched on. Rockets launched into space, interstate highways cut across the continent, and television brought news of distant wars and civil movements into every living room. But Kaiser's vision remained quietly steadfast, the belief that industry, when harnessed with purpose and care, could uplift humanity. He began corresponding with engineers and young innovators across the nation, offering advice, encouragement, and sometimes blunt warnings. "Don't stop at what's easy," he wrote in one letter. "If it challenges you, it will change you, and if it changes you, it can change the world." In these exchanges, he often mentioned Roosevelt, speaking of the president not just as a historical figure, but as a mentor, a lodestar, a man whose trust had shaped his destiny. "Franklin believed in the act of trying," he wrote to one young engineer, "and trying, even when the world says it's impossible, is the true measure of courage." One evening, a storm rolled in from the Pacific. The wind rattled the windows and rain pelted the roof in a steady rhythm. Kaiser sat in his study, listening, the storm outside mirroring the chaos he had once thrived in during the shipbuilding years. Lightning flashed across the bay, illuminating the ocean in stark silver, and for a moment he imagined the Liberty ships in formation, slicing through the waves. He closed his eyes and could almost hear the roar of the yards, the clang of metal, the voices of welders shouting over the sparks. It was all there, the fear, the triumph, the unrelenting motion of a country refusing to surrender. In the storm's echo, he whispered, "We did it, Franklin, we built the impossible," and they still remember. The wind carried his words into the night, blending with the rhythm of the ocean, the distant hum of ships, and the quiet pulse of a world that had been forever altered by belief and action. Even as he aged, Kaiser's vision never faded. He continued to write, to sketch, to advise, and to dream. He insisted on walking along the beach every morning, cane in hand, feeling the pull of the tides as though the ocean itself kept him tethered to the continuity of life and work. Visitors noticed that his stories often looped back to Roosevelt, the president who had entrusted him with responsibility, who had recognized potential where others saw limitation, who had offered a single, simple phrase that had guided him through decades of creation: "Let him try." Kaiser's own words reflected that same philosophy. "It's not the success or the speed that matters," he told a visiting historian once. "It's the courage to begin, the willingness to act, the refusal to accept that something cannot be done." And even as the world shifted around him, new industries, new challenges, new conflicts, Kaiser remained a living bridge to that era of relentless creation, an unbroken thread connecting Roosevelt's vision to the present. At night, he would sometimes sit on the veranda, staring into the horizon. Ships passed far out to sea, blinking lights against the dark water. Each one was a quiet reminder that the work of builders never truly ends, that every generation carries the tools, the knowledge, and the inspiration of those who dared to act. Henry Kaiser, in his final years, seemed to exist between two worlds: the one he had physically shaped with steel and sweat, and the one he had inspired, filled with ideas, belief, and motion. Both were real, both enduring, both a testament to what happens when someone refuses to accept limits. And as he listened to the ocean's endless rhythm, he whispered to no one but the night itself, "The work never ends, it only passes from hand to hand, and as long as they try, we live again." The years crept forward, each one quieter than the last, yet Henry Kaiser's mind remained as restless as ever. Though his body grew frail, he refused to surrender to the stillness that age demanded. Every day he rose before dawn, watching the first light scatter across the Pacific, tracing the silver trails on the water where ships might glide. In his eyes, those distant vessels were echoes of the Liberty ships, reminders that human endeavor could still defy expectation. Visitors became rarer, but letters and messages from engineers, medical administrators, and former workers arrived steadily. Each carried gratitude, admiration, or questions about the past and future. Kaiser treated each carefully, responding when he could, always circling back to the lesson that had guided him since 1941: don't let anyone tell you it's impossible. He began compiling notes and reflections into a loose memoir, a record not just of his achievements but of the philosophy behind them. Blueprints for hospitals, housing, and industrial processes littered his desk. Sketches overlapped with journal entries, sometimes chaotic, sometimes precise, but always alive with thought and vision. He wrote often about Roosevelt. "Franklin understood," one entry read, "that progress is built on trust, courage, and the willingness to act without guarantee. He gave me that gift, and with it I could build more than ships, I could build belief itself." One afternoon, a small group of former shipyard workers arrived unexpectedly. They were older now, weathered by years, yet still carrying the energy and pride of their youth. They had come to honor Kaiser not with ceremony but with memory. He greeted them quietly, his cane tapping softly on the terrace. "It's been too long," he said. "Do you remember the days of fire and steel?" They laughed, the sound carrying the weight of decades. They spoke of long shifts, of sparks that burned through the night, of hulls sliding into water, to cheers that seemed endless. And as they spoke, Kaiser nodded, listening to every detail as if it were a hymn. "It wasn't just ships," he said finally, his voice calm but resonant. "It was what we proved we could do, that when belief meets action, miracles are possible. Franklin understood that, and so did you." Tears glistened in the eyes of one of the men. "We followed you," he said, "because you believed it could be done." Kaiser's smile was faint but certain. "No," he corrected gently, "because we all believed together." As twilight descended over the bay, Kaiser walked slowly to the balcony. The horizon glowed with the fading light and the waves reflected it in a restless shimmer. He listened to the distant horn of a passing cargo ship, a sound that had become, over the years, both comfort and reminder. He whispered to himself, "They still move, they still try." That night, he returned to his study and sat before the array of papers, photographs, and blueprints. He opened a folder containing old wartime photographs: men welding hulls, cranes lifting steel, ships lined up like an unstoppable army. He traced a finger over the images, recalling the names, the faces, the voices. "They all did their part," he murmured. "And together we built more than steel, we built courage, we built belief, we built a nation capable of anything." The storm outside began to gather again, rain tapping rhythmically against the windows. It reminded him of nights in the yards, when sparks flew and sirens blared and the entire world seemed to move at the pace of human determination. And in that rhythm, Kaiser heard something eternal: the heartbeat of effort, the pulse of progress, the echo of Roosevelt's command to act, to try, to believe. He leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting toward the horizon, whispering once more, "The work never ends. It only moves on, and as long as they try, the story continues." Outside, the Pacific rolled endlessly, waves rising and falling, carrying with them the memory of steel, sweat, and belief. The ships may have sailed long ago, the docks may have quieted, but the legacy remained, alive, persistent, unbroken. As the 1960s deepened, Henry Kaiser's life became a quiet rhythm of reflection, correspondence, and careful observation. Though his body weakened, his mind remained alert, endlessly wandering through past triumphs and future possibilities. Every morning, he would rise before dawn, standing at the window to watch the Pacific stir beneath the first light. The horizon reminded him of the days when shipyards hummed like living organisms, steel sparking and men shouting, each vessel a testament to human ingenuity. Kaiser continued his correspondence with engineers, medical administrators, and young innovators across the country. Every letter carried his philosophy: don't let anyone tell you it's impossible, start anyway, let the work itself teach the way. One morning, a young naval engineer arrived unexpectedly at his home. She had traveled across the mainland, eager to meet the man who had built the Liberty ships that had turned the tide of the war. "Mr. Kaiser," she said, notebook in hand, "how did you keep everyone moving when it seemed impossible?" Kaiser leaned on his cane, eyes distant yet bright. "I didn't move them," he replied. "I moved myself. Belief is contagious. If you act with conviction, others will follow." Franklin understood that. He believed in people before they believed in themselves. The engineer listened intently as Kaiser spoke of Roosevelt, of the fire of the shipyards, and of the simple but profound idea that action can overcome fear and doubt. He recounted stories of men working nights in weld-streaked overalls, of women operating cranes with precision and pride, of hulls sliding into the water to the cheers of a nation. "Each ship wasn't just a vessel," he said, voice quiet but firm. "It was a proof of possibility, a message that we could rise to any challenge if we tried." Evenings were often spent on the veranda overlooking the ocean. The rhythmic pulse of the waves reminded him of the pulse of industry, of human effort moving in harmony with purpose. Cargo ships passed on the horizon, each one a faint echo of the Liberty ships, carrying with them the legacy of belief, construction, and perseverance. He thought of the hundreds of thousands of workers who had followed his lead, of the engineers who had turned sketches into reality, of Roosevelt's unshakable trust that had allowed it all to begin. The enormity of it sometimes made him quiet, lost in memory and gratitude. A storm rolled in one night, wind and rain rattling the windows, reminding him of the nights in Richmond and Portland when sparks flew against the darkened sky and the hum of the shipyard seemed to shake the earth. Kaiser listened to the storm, and in its rhythm he heard the heartbeat of that era, the pulse of courage, determination, and relentless effort. "They still move," he whispered to the night. "They still build, they still try." In his final years, Kaiser devoted himself to reflection and instruction. Young engineers and historians visited, seeking wisdom from the man who had built the impossible. He shared stories, sketches, and principles, emphasizing the timeless lesson he had learned from Roosevelt: that leadership is measured not by control but by faith in others. One visitor asked him if he ever feared failure. Kaiser shook his head. "Fear is only useful if it moves you to act, not if it stops you. Franklin taught me that. The real failure is refusing to start." He spent long hours revisiting old blueprints, imagining new possibilities, tracing the line from steel hulls to hospitals to communities in need. Even as his body slowed, his mind remained a workshop of ideas, each one carrying forward the spirit of creation he had inherited from the man who once told him simply, "Let him try." At night, he would sit in his study, the ocean visible through the window, listening to the hum of distant ships and the crash of waves against the shore. He often whispered to the sea as if sharing secrets with it, "We built a bridge of belief across the impossible, and it still stands." Outside, the Pacific continued its endless motion, carrying with it the echoes of a generation that refused to accept limits. Henry Kaiser, despite age and frailty, felt connected to that rhythm, knowing that the legacy of effort and faith he had helped create would endure as long as people dared to try. As the years edged further into the 1960s, Henry Kaiser's days became a blend of quiet reflection and purposeful observation. The Pacific stretched endlessly before him, its waves a constant reminder of both the work that had been done and the potential still ahead. Even in frailty, his eyes held the sharp clarity of a man who had spent decades turning ideas into reality. Each morning he sat at the window with a cup of coffee, tracing the horizon as cargo ships passed in the distance. He imagined the Liberty ships in their prime, sliding into the water under the cheers of thousands, each hull a testament to belief made tangible. Sometimes he would close his eyes and hear again the clang of hammers, the hiss of welding torches, and the rhythmic thrum of engines, sounds that had once filled the shipyards day and night. Letters continued to arrive, often from young engineers and medical professionals seeking guidance. Kaiser answered what he could, carefully choosing words that conveyed not just instruction but philosophy. "The impossible is only impossible until someone tries," he wrote to one hopeful graduate. "Don't wait for permission, the world will follow the bold." On a particularly warm afternoon, a small group of former shipyard workers arrived unannounced. Now older, their hair streaked with gray, they carried the same pride that had once driven them to work long hours in the yards. They came to share stories, to reminisce, and to honor the man who had led them when the impossible demanded action. Kaiser greeted them warmly, though his body required the support of his cane. They spoke of nights spent welding under floodlights, of hulls sliding into the water to the sound of sirens and cheers, and of the camaraderie forged in shared struggle. "It wasn't just steel we built," Kaiser said softly, eyes glimmering. "It was belief, courage, and trust. Every ship carried the spirit of everyone who touched it, from the engineers to the welders to the president who trusted us to try." A former foreman nodded, emotion evident in his voice. "We followed you because you believed, that made all the difference." Kaiser smiled faintly. "No, we believed together, that's what made it unstoppable." As twilight fell, the Pacific glimmered in streaks of gold and silver, each wave catching the last rays of sunlight. Kaiser walked slowly to the balcony, leaning against the railing, listening to the rhythmic pulse of the ocean. The distant horn of a passing ship echoed faintly, a familiar sound that had always reminded him of movement, purpose, and continuity. He thought of Roosevelt, of the simple yet powerful directive that had shaped his life. "Let him try." It was a phrase that had carried across decades, through the chaos of war and the quiet of peace, inspiring both action and belief. Kaiser often imagined the president watching from afar, approving the endless effort that had grown from a single moment of trust. "I wonder if he knows," Kaiser whispered to the horizon, "how far we carried it, how many lives were touched, how many possibilities opened by a simple act of faith." The nights grew long, but Kaiser remained engaged, reviewing blueprints, drafting new ideas for hospitals, housing, and energy systems. Even in his twilight years, he refused to stop imagining, sketching, and planning. He told those who visited that creation was the ultimate form of defiance, and that every generation had the opportunity and responsibility to build anew. "Do not be content with what exists," he said to a young engineer. "Take what is given and make it more. Even when the world says it cannot be done, act anyway. That is how we change history." And outside, the ocean continued its ceaseless rhythm, carrying with it the memory of ships, men, and dreams. The legacy of Roosevelt's trust, of Kaiser's ambition, and of thousands of workers' perseverance pulsed quietly in every passing wave. Henry Kaiser, still alert in mind and spirit, felt that pulse deeply. It was a reminder that while time might erode steel and memory, the essence of creation, faith in action, courage against impossibility, endured beyond the limitations of any single life. As the years pressed on, Henry Kaiser's presence became quieter yet more contemplative, the ocean outside his window serving as a constant reminder of motion and continuity. Each morning he rose before dawn, leaning on his cane, eyes fixed on the horizon where distant cargo ships traced silver paths across the water. In his mind they were Liberty ships again, hulls glinting under floodlights, cranes swinging, welders shouting over the hiss of torches. Every wave mirrored the rhythm of those days, the pulse of human effort synchronized with the sea. Letters from young engineers, medical administrators, and historians arrived steadily, and Kaiser answered each with care, often emphasizing the same lesson he had lived by: start anyway, act first. The world will adjust to those who move. He spoke of Roosevelt often, recalling the president's trust as the catalyst for everything, the moment someone had believed enough in him to allow the impossible to begin. On a warm afternoon, former shipyard workers arrived to honor him, older now, voices tinged with nostalgia, carrying memories of steel and sparks of long nights and unwavering effort. Kaiser greeted them with a faint smile, speaking softly yet with clarity. It wasn't just ships we built, it was courage, belief, and unity. Every hull carried a part of everyone who touched it and the president who trusted us to try. A foreman whispered, emotion thick in his words. We followed because you believed. Kaiser shook his head. No, we believed together, and that made us unstoppable. Asterisk. As twilight fell, the ocean reflected streaks of gold and silver, the distant horn of a ship sounding like an echo from decades past. Kaiser leaned on the balcony railing, breathing in the salt air, imagining Roosevelt observing the legacy of trust he had sown, whispering the simple phrase that had shaped so much. Let him try. Kaiser whispered back to the horizon. We carried it far, Franklin. We touched lives and opened possibilities beyond what you imagined. Nights grew longer, yet he remained active, reviewing blueprints for hospitals, housing, and energy projects, instructing visitors that creation was the ultimate defiance, that every generation could build anew from the same principles of courage and effort. He told a young engineer, do not settle for what exists, make it better. Act when told you cannot, and history will follow. The ocean continued its endless rhythm, waves rolling in like the heartbeat of perseverance itself, carrying the legacy of Roosevelt's trust, of Kaiser's vision, and of thousands of hands that had labored in belief. Even as time weighed on him, Henry Kaiser felt that pulse deeply, a reminder that steel and memory fade but faith in action endures, and that as long as someone dares to try, the story of human determination continues unbroken. The months turned into years, and Henry Kaiser's presence became more contemplative, yet the fire in his mind never dimmed. Each morning he would rise before dawn, leaning on his cane, and watch the Pacific stretch endlessly, imagining the waves as the rhythm of industry and human endeavor. Ships passed on the horizon, distant and small, yet to him they were still Liberty ships, sliding into the water amid the clang of metal, the hiss of torches, and the voices of welders shouting over the roar of progress. Letters continued to arrive from young engineers, historians, and former workers, each carrying questions, gratitude, or the spark of curiosity, and Kaiser answered them all with care, reminding them repeatedly, do not wait for permission. Act. The impossible only exists until someone tries. He reflected often on Roosevelt, the man who had entrusted him with responsibility, whose simple words, let him try, had catalyzed a lifetime of creation. Former shipyard workers visited sporadically, older now, their voices tinged with nostalgia, sharing memories of nights filled with sparks and effort, of hulls sliding into the water, of the unity that had transformed impossibility into reality. Kaiser would speak softly. We didn't just build ships. We built belief, courage, and a testament to what people can achieve together. Every ship carried a piece of everyone who touched it and the faith of a president who dared to trust. One man said, we followed because you believed. Kaiser shook his head. No, we all believed together, and that made us unstoppable. Asterisk. As twilight fell, he walked to the balcony, the ocean reflecting streaks of gold and silver, and listened to the faint horn of a ship in the distance, a sound that carried decades of memory. He whispered to the horizon, we carried it far, Franklin. The lives we touched, the possibilities we opened, it all began with your trust. Asterisk. Even in the long nights, he continued to sketch, draft, and write, working on plans for hospitals, housing, and innovations that might never be built, teaching every visitor that creation is the highest form of defiance, that action against impossibility shapes the future. To a young engineer he said, do not accept limits, take what is given and improve it. Act boldly even when the world doubts you, and history will follow. Asterisk. The Pacific rolled endlessly, waves carrying the echo of ships, labor, and faith. The legacy of Roosevelt's trust, Kaiser's vision, and the hands of thousands persisted in every passing vessel and every ripple on the water. Henry Kaiser felt that pulse in his chest, knowing that while time erodes steel and memory, belief in action endures. As long as someone dares to try, as long as hands keep building, the story of human determination continues, unbroken, relentless. Eternal years blended into decades, yet Henry Kaiser remained a vigilant witness to the passage of time, his mind sharp even as his body grew frail. Each morning he rose before dawn, cane in hand, and gazed at the Pacific, the waves rolling endlessly like the pulse of human effort itself. To him, every passing ship was a liberty ship again, hulls sliding into water, sparks flying, welders shouting, a chorus of determination echoing through history. Letters continued to arrive from young engineers, medical administrators, historians, and admirers, each carrying questions, ideas, or gratitude, and Kaiser answered each with care, always returning to the principle that had defined his life. Do not wait for permission. Begin anyway. Action turns impossibility into reality. Roosevelt remained a constant presence in his reflections. The president's trust in the simple phrase, let him try, shaping decades of creation that had touched thousands of lives. Former shipyard workers visited occasionally, older now, voices lined with memory, sharing stories of nights filled with sparks and effort, of hulls sliding into the water, of camaraderie and unity that had made the impossible attainable. Kaiser spoke softly yet with authority. We didn't merely build ships. We built belief, courage, and proof that humans can achieve extraordinary things together. Every ship carried a piece of everyone involved and the faith of a president who dared to trust. One man said, "We followed because you believed." Kaiser shook his head gently. "No, we all believed together, and that made us unstoppable." Asterisk at twilight he walked to the balcony, the Pacific shimmering in streaks of gold and silver, the faint horn of a distant ship carrying the weight of decades. He whispered to the horizon, "We carried it far, Franklin. Every life touched, every possibility opened, it all began with your trust." Asterisk long nights were spent sketching, drafting, and writing, creating plans for hospitals, housing, and energy projects, some never to be built, teaching visitors that creation is the ultimate defiance, that daring to act against impossibility shapes the future. To a young engineer he said, "Do not accept limits. Take what exists and improve it. Act boldly even when the world doubts you, and history will follow." Asterisk the Pacific rolled on, waves echoing the legacy of ships, labor, and belief. The trust Roosevelt placed, the vision Kaiser nurtured, and the work of thousands of hands persisted in every vessel and ripple. Henry Kaiser felt that pulse within, understanding that while steel may rust and memories fade, belief in action endures. As long as someone dares to try, as long as hands keep building, the story of human determination continues, unbroken, relentless, eternal, and the horizon forever invites the next generation to act, to build, and to believe. Time continued its quiet passage, yet Henry Kaiser's mind remained alert, ever restless even as his body grew frail. Each morning he rose before dawn, cane in hand, and stood at the window watching the Pacific, the waves rolling endlessly like the pulse of human endeavor. Every distant ship became a liberty ship in his imagination, gliding into water under floodlights, sparks flying, welders shouting, a symphony of courage and determination. Letters continued to arrive from engineers, historians, medical administrators, and admirers, each carrying questions, gratitude, or inspiration, and Kaiser answered them carefully, always returning to the lesson that had guided him all his life. Begin, act. The impossible only exists until someone tries. He thought often of Roosevelt, whose trust in words, "let him try," had ignited decades of creation, shaping lives and opening possibilities. Former shipyard workers visited occasionally, older now, voices lined with memory, recounting nights of sparks, hulls sliding into the water, and the camaraderie that had made the impossible real. Kaiser spoke softly yet with unwavering authority. We didn't just build ships. We built belief, courage, and proof that humans can accomplish extraordinary things together. Every ship carried a part of everyone who touched it and the faith of a president who dared to trust. One man said, "We followed because you believed." Kaiser shook his head. "No, we all believed together, and that made us unstoppable." Asterisk at twilight he walked to the balcony, the Pacific reflecting streaks of gold and silver, the faint horn of a distant ship carrying echoes of decades past. He whispered to the horizon, "We carried it far, Franklin. Every life touched, every possibility opened, it all began with your trust." Asterisk even in the long nights he sketched, drafted, and wrote, working on hospitals, housing, and energy projects, some never to be realized, teaching every visitor that creation is the highest form of defiance, that daring to act against impossibility shapes the future. To a young engineer he said, "Do not accept limits. Take what exists and improve it. Act boldly even when the world doubts you, and history will follow." Asterisk the Pacific rolled endlessly, waves echoing the legacy of ships, labor, and belief. Roosevelt's trust, Kaiser's vision, and the hands of thousands persisted in every passing vessel and ripple. Henry Kaiser felt that pulse deep within, knowing that while steel erodes and memories fade, faith in action endures. As long as someone dares to try, as long as hands keep building, the story of human determination continues, unbroken, relentless, eternal, and the horizon always invites the next generation to act, to build, and to believe, carrying forward the legacy of courage, trust, and unwavering human effort into the endless future. And so we come to the quiet truth that lingers beyond the roar of shipyards, beyond the sparks of welding torches, beyond the thunder of hammers striking steel. It is not the ships themselves that endure, nor the accolades, nor the monuments built to commemorate deeds of man. It is the belief that action matters, that courage matters, that the willingness to try, even in the face of impossibility, shapes the very essence of human history. Henry Kaiser, guided by the trust of a president who dared to see potential where others saw limitations, taught a generation and generations to come that the measure of a man is not in the comfort he seeks but in the challenge he accepts. The Liberty ships that once slid into the waters of the Pacific were more than vessels. They were symbols of collective will, proof that ordinary men and women, when united by purpose, can accomplish feats that defy imagination. Every rivet, every weld, every day spent laboring through exhaustion and uncertainty was a testament to the power of belief, to the transformative force of dedication, to the quiet yet unyielding rhythm of effort sustained over time. And yet the lesson does not end in the yards of Richmond or Portland, nor in the photographs that freeze moments of triumph. It lives on in the spirit that moves us to act, that pushes us to innovate, that challenges us to build, to create, and to believe when all reason suggests we should falter. As Kaiser reflected in his later years, it was never about steel or schedules, contracts or deadlines. It was about courage, the courage to begin without guarantee, the courage to trust in others, the courage to imagine that what seems impossible is merely untried. It was Roosevelt's vision that first ignited that fire, a vision rooted in the belief that people are capable of extraordinary achievement when given faith, guidance, and opportunity. And Kaiser carried that torch across decades, through the chaos of war, the calm of peace, the evolution of industry, and the changing tides of society, proving again and again that leadership is measured not by command alone, but by the ability to inspire, to empower, to awaken the potential hidden within ordinary hands and hearts. And now, as we look to the horizon, as we listen to the distant hum of ships, the endless rhythm of waves against the shore, we recognize that this legacy is not confined to history books or museum walls. It is alive in every hand that dares to build, in every mind that dares to imagine, in every heart that refuses to accept limitation. It is in the engineers designing solutions for a better world, in the doctors building hospitals in underserved regions, in the innovators challenging old assumptions to create new possibilities. It is in the young person who looks at a problem and refuses to say it cannot be done, choosing instead to try, to act, to transform vision into reality. And so we honor the lives of those who built the impossible, not merely for the ships or factories or monuments they left behind, but for the spirit they unleashed, a spirit that moves quietly yet powerfully through generations, reminding us that progress is never automatic, that courage is never obsolete, that belief in action is the truest form of legacy. We are all in our own ways heirs to that determination, inheritors of a trust passed from president to shipbuilder, from leader to worker, from past to present, a trust that says we can move mountains, we can build bridges, we can shape worlds if only we act with conviction, if only we begin. And as the sun sets over the endless waters, casting gold and silver across the waves, we see that the story does not end with Kaiser or Roosevelt or a single fleet of ships. It continues in every act of courage, every creation born from faith, every life committed to the belief that the impossible is nothing more than a challenge waiting to be met. Let us carry that vision forward, let us honor that legacy, let us act, build, imagine, and believe, for as long as we dare to try, the world itself becomes our canvas, and the horizon, like the ocean, stretches endlessly before us, filled with infinite possibility, waiting for the next hand to take up the tools of creation and leave behind a mark that will echo through time, a mark that proves, as Kaiser and Roosevelt once knew, that human determination, when united by purpose and guided by trust, is the most enduring force of all, shaping not just steel and ships, but the very destiny of generations yet to come, and reminding us that every effort, no matter how small, is a thread in the vast tapestry of progress, that every courageous act contributes to a legacy that cannot be measured in monuments alone, but in the countless lives inspired to act, to build, to believe, and that in this ongoing story there are no endings, only beginnings. As the spirit of creation, courage, and relentless determination continues to flow, like the endless waves upon the Pacific, carrying forward the eternal promise that as long as humans dare to try, the impossible will always be within reach, and history itself will bend to the will of those who have the courage to begin.